Hey guys, James here with another book review. Took a while to get through this one for some reason, but I did it, and I'm today reviewing Dragons of Autumn Twilight by Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss, or Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, as it says on the book cover. Now you may notice this book is massive. That's not why it took me forever to get through, because this is actually a bind-up version of the first 3 books in the Dragonlance Chronicles. So we're just doing this top one, Dragons of Autumn Twilight, which is the first book in the series. Obviously, I didn't just read the 3rd one first. Obviously. So you might be wondering, what is Dragons of Autumn Twilight all about? Well, the Dragonlance Chronicles was created by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman as a novelization of their Dungeons and Dragons campaign, which is set in the world of Krynn, a world where the gods of old have left, and the man, dwarf, elf and Kender, which is like a little halfling kind of guy, are left to fend for themselves until the return of the dark goddess, which doesn't have a name in this first one, but is called Takesis, which is like a 5-headed dragon god, returns to the world with an army of dragons intent on doing something. Not really clear at the moment what their end goal is. But yeah, this is about just Dungeons and Dragons adventuring, basically, and yes, alright. There's not really a lot to say about it, to be honest. If you told someone about what fantasy is and said, just write me any old guff, this is probably what they'd come back with. It's probably the most generic fantasy I've read since Sword of Shannara, because it kind of has that same vibe. It's the overpowered adventuring party going around doing some things. The characters are all kind of one note and just very flat. There's not a lot of depth to them. You've got, a fighter guy who is broody. You've got another fighter guy who's sort of a big Dumbo. You've got a half-elf guy whose only concern is whether he's half-elf or half-human. You've got some barbarian people who just are in a relationship, and that's really all they do. And you've got a halfling, like a Kender, who is a kleptomaniac, and that's his only real personality trait. You've got a dwarf who does blacksmithery and is grumpy. And you've got a wizard who is the only developed character really in the whole group, which is probably why he was chosen to be the lead protagonist and antagonist in his own spin-off series. But not to judge or say who the best character in the series is, but it's definitely Raistlin, the potentially evil wizard. Yeah, so the characters all kind of flat. They have some good adventure-y kind of banter. Just because they're flat characters doesn't mean they're necessarily bad characters. I did a video a while ago where I talked about the difference between a static and dynamic character. Mainly I was talking about a hard-boiled detective and how they never really change. But this is sort of the same thing with this adventuring group. The characters don't really develop. They sort of just are them at the start, and then at the end are also just the way they are. Raistlin is the only exception. Raistlin is this evil wizard, potentially evil, but he's the hero's friend, right? He's the brother, twin brother of this big strong warrior guy, but he's always feeble. He's got a big chip on his shoulder because he's not boisterous and outgoing like the other guys. He's the guy at your Dungeons and Dragons table who wrote a 3-page backstory for his character and is slowly developing it into a Name of the Wind style epic fantasy series by himself. And no one else wants to roleplay properly, but he's just please let me roleplay, and the dungeon master has rewarded him by making most of the adventure about him. So that's kind of the gist of what the characters are like. Not really too much to say about it. The plot, similarly, is kind of thin. we introduced to these characters, and like straight away they're just sort of under attack by goblins, which is naturally the Dungeons and Dragons de facto start point. They get attacked by goblins in a tavern. But yeah, they're like sort of immediately thrust on this adventure, and then they go along and do some adventuring in the woods, and they do some adventuring in a old lost city, and they do like a adventuring in a dungeon and in a fortress, and they fight a dragon, and then it's sort of just the end of the book. It's not really complicated. You don't really learn much about anything. The villains are introduced like incredibly late into the story. Probably in the last 50 or so pages, we sort of learn who the villains are, and they're just sort of dispatched. Because as villains are, they're kind of flat. You get this sort of overarching, you've got all this sort of underneath stuff about the gods returning, because that's sort of what the thrust of the quest is about, is trying to recapture the magic of the old gods, and that's sort of the starting point to it all. But I don't really know why there's a big war now that's happening. I guess it's just to take over the world. Like I say, it's very cookie cutter, very generic. I know back in the day, like this series gets a lot of props because it's one of those fantasy series that's come out around the spawning point of Dungeons and Dragons. It's based on the game, so a lot of people that play Dungeons and Dragons flock to it, and I think they just flocked to it when they were younger, before fantasy had really developed. Like, I think this was published originally, it must be the 80s. Surely it must be the 80s, potentially early 90s, but this is like in the days when fantasy was still like high fantasy. It wasn't all this grim, character-driven, grim, dark fantasy that we get now. It doesn't have that modern sensibility to it, and as a result I did find it kind of difficult to read through sometimes, just because it was so verbose, but not really verbose. It just kind of is long without being that long. It's under 400 pages, but it feels kind of long. It drags about when they're doing like, you know, the wandering adventure stuff, and there's not really a strong character pull. The only thing really keeping me pulling through the book was to see what Raceland was going to get up to, because he just is a really interesting character, and I'm going to continue with the series just to see how he develops, and I want to read like the trilogy that involves him, which is why I kind of need to get through this just to get to that. So yeah, I mean, it's okay. It's a 3-star read. Like, it's not, you're not gonna be upset if you read it, but it's not gonna fucking wow your socks off or anything. This was published originally in 1984, by the way, so that is, yeah, very old traditional style sword and sorcery kind of fantasy, with the high fantasy elements. It's all very D&D. If you've played Dungeons and Dragons, I think you'll get a kick out of it just to see some of the things that happen and that remind you of your campaign. But that's it, really. Not much more to say on that one. Good book. Don't regret reading it. I'll carry on with the series. It didn't blow me away, but hey ho, you can't all be 5-star winners, and that's it. So thanks for watching the video, guys. Join me on Wednesday when I'll be doing the mid-year book freakout tag, and join me on Friday as well when I'm going to be doing a little revisit to Dragons of Autumn Twilight, this time from the perspective of a beleaguered dungeon master trying to wrangle his group of 8 characters through this wacky adventure. So if that sounds good to you, subscribe, join me then, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.